dishing the dirt on your former colleagues. But just in case, there's a number of customers who weren't able to make the recording today and have requested that we would provide it later on. I suppose we're all veterans now of the webinar format, but if we'll just go through some basic housekeeping. So if you could keep your microphones and cameras on mute, it just helps with the quality and avoids any background noise. And we will be, so I've got a bunch of questions that I'll be asking Bruce throughout the course of the webinar, but there is a little chat button if you look on the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. So if you do have any questions that you think are not being covered over the course of the webinar, feel free to shoot them through and I'll fire them Laurie Oak style at Bruce as we go. So Bruce, really appreciate you joining us. A really unique perspective that we're confident that you'll be able to provide us. So this is the second Judo Expert Series that we've been able to run. We're backed by popular demand, and what we're really trying to do is give our customers an insight into different areas as you know the COVID-19 pandemic rumbles on. Just for a bit of context setting, maybe to kick us off, sort of thinking back to your days as the small business minister in the Abbott government. What was the biggest crisis you dealt with during that time, and what was the most fiery cabinet meeting you remember?
Oh, look, there's been a few of them, and I should welcome everybody and say thank you for having me along. And I'd thank Frank. He was going to send me some questions so I could be properly prepped, but he thought, no, he'll go the Laurie Oak style and give me nothing. So this could go anywhere. But so thanks for that, Frank. Look, it was interesting times. We fiery, probably. Troop deployments were some of the most difficult issues. You're putting Australians in harm's way to pursue our national interest, and then when you're thinking about what our sorry for the jargon, what our hang time is for our jet fighters over Iran, and then working out where they need to take off from and refuel mid-flight and how much time they had over Iran, and then contemplate horrors such as if one of them went down, how we'd get our people out safely and not have them paraded around by mad people for propaganda purposes. They're interesting character building discussions. Probably the feistiest one, you might remember I was the champion of energising enterprise. So I had quite a few big battles. That tax package that was all about, turbocharging small business. Hasn't the instant asset write-off become very popular all of a sudden? It's everybody's claiming that. But some of the competition reforms were pretty tough, Frank. We've got a very concentrated economy here, but I thought some of the weakest misuse of market power and competition protection, not protecting competitors, but protecting the competitive process. They were tough debates. I mean, I'm a Tigers fan. You don't prove your dominance in a market by locking the gates so no one else can get onto the G. But, that's the sort of legal challenge that we were facing, and that needed to be resolved, and big vested interest. So that was character building. And when things aren't going great, it's tough to get people to stay focused, and a little bit of cabinet discipline can file away, drain away a little bit, and reminding your colleagues that it's a team sport, good governance. You can't cope with that, we'll rack off and do something else. They're interesting conversations to have too.
Yeah, absolutely. And you did remind me, I should have welcomed everyone to the call. We do have a collection of our customers from around the country, as well as some internal staff at Judo. So thank you everyone for joining. So moving to the topic of the day, which is obviously the coronavirus. Is this something, a pandemic, is this something that is planned for? Is there sort of a working hypothesis in government as to what would happen if this was to ever take place?
Yeah, there is, but it's largely through a health lens. In fact, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott back in the, I think about 2004, 2005 was alerting people to this very scenario, and that, it could have an enormous impact. My work way back was, I was the face of overseas tragedy, if I could put it that way. So when the tsunami hit, I had a very, very heavy work schedule over many months, but it highlighted, I suppose, a counter disaster capability we needed. So there was a it led to a national stockpile of critical resources that we would need in the event of a disaster, and health pandemics are in that frame. Even our military plans for it in terms of scenario planning and what stressors may be in the region. And of course, we're in a part of the world where novel coronaviruses aren't new. We've had them before. They've been challenging. They've been contained, and we know the impacts that are at risk. What's different here is no one knows what the economic impacts are. So this is a jolt to the economy, and I'm trying not to use the word unprecedented. If you had $1 for every time someone said that, you'd be a wealthy person. But we've not been here before. You look at some of the other economic setbacks. You look at the GFC. Well, that was a finance system, a liquidity issue. You kind of had an idea how to deal with it. Downturns in economic activity, recessions we had to have in the Keating era, or even global economic downturns are usually slow creeping things, not a big bang, not an assault almost on the economy. It's not a structural thing in the economy. Keating was seeking to deal with, and it's not an event like the Y2K. So it's something quite unusual, and people, well, probably being a little unkind here, there's this fallacy of forecast precision running around, as if people can nail exactly what the future looks like. Look, they can't. No one really knows, because it's hitting confidence, it's hitting investment, it's hitting markets in the way they operate. People are being disrupted. It's an 8% hit to our economy by about June, according to the RBA's figures. Some hope that it'll bounce back after the deepest trough being around a 10% hit in the economy, and then it'll come back. But no one's really quite sure. So that's tough. And it's hitting our trading partners. We're a highly dependent trading nation. So a lot of the markets and supply chains that we deal with, they're coming at it in a different way. So a bit like a tsunami, it is moving around the globe as the virus moves around the globe, and that's having differential impacts in different economies as well.
So take us back to February, I suppose it was,
Yep.
when it started to become apparent that it wasn't going to be contained to Wuhan province in China, and that it was potentially going to escalate into the pandemic that we've got today. What would the government sort of dialogue have been internally? How would they have contemplated? Do you think that the full lockdown, economic hibernation measures would have been modelled? Is this, is it something that would have achieved a consensus view really early, or would that have been a fierce debate? What would those early cabinet meetings have looked like?
Well, they would have looked at SARS and said, well, what did we learn? What do we know? They would have looked at success in containment and frankly, transparency around where infection cases were emerging, and then working out what to do about it. In this case, they would have probably looked at Taiwan. Taiwan, has got an interesting history with mainland China, and lots of argy-bargy goes on between the two, but they seem to know each other pretty well. And Taiwan went into a partial lockdown near the end of January. So, they were sort of saying, hang on, this is not being contained well enough. A lot of inbound, outbound traffic. So they started quite early. For Australia, we were quite notable for two reasons. We banned international travel very early in the piece, and you might remember got a bit of a bagging out of the World Health Organization and others for doing so. But that was because mobility, people movement was what was causing the spread. And we've got deep relationships with, Wuhan in particular as an economic hub in China. A lot of movement between our economies and in and out of Southeast Asia. And you might remember it was quite interesting when one of our ministers said quite early, this is a pandemic, technical definition being the spread of the virus, factored in the rate of the spread. And they're saying, well, hasn't been declared, but this is what we're dealing with. So I think those early discussions, Minister Hunt and our Brendan Murphy, our Chief Medical Officer, highly alert to that environment. And there's Greg was down watching his son play cricket at Balnowring, and Brendan rang up and said, this is moving too much. We've got to shut the borders. And then see if we can contain it here, but recognising that's where the majority of infections have come from, people moving around.
It's one of the interesting things to come out of it all has been the creation of the National Cabinet, which I to express my own opinion, I think it's worked reasonably effectively at being able to deliver sort of consensus emergency measures across the country. But there has been some divergence, particularly out of New South Wales and probably mostly in Victoria. Do you have any comments on the performance of the National Cabinet and on sort of some of the uneasy relationship, particularly between politicians on opposite sides of the political divide? How much of it is politically motivated? How much of it do you think is ideological differences? And how have you seen it all sort of working together up until now?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. The people that crafted our constitution near the end of the 1800s actually said we need to provide a mechanism where there's a team effort and everyone comes together. So, they were contemplating that kind of structure even back when the Commonwealth of Australia was being formed. Few people have talked about it being activated for things like Murray-Darling Basin. They're going, well, that's not a big deal in Perth and things like that. So that was good to see, but it also recognises that our constitution does divide the powers. All of the stuff you see ordinarily around your community is controlled by the states. And when the deal was done to form the Commonwealth, they were at that stage, the states were their own colonies and the governors were like their own presidents. They didn't want to give away too much power. So most of the powers are actually with the states. Over time, money has played a big role. And you see this play out in some of the decision making. At the National Cabinet, you'll find an effort to find a consensus, usually at a framework or a principles level, and then the states and territories are able to operationalise that framework as they see fit within their own jurisdictions. That's because that's where the powers are, in terms of movement of people, transport systems, health systems, education systems, even trading hours and things like that, and the powers that are available to a state government when they declare a state of emergency. You can be as helpful as you can as the Prime Minister and be as collegiate as you can, but the execution rests very much with the states and territories. It's interesting, though, that political divide, it's played out a little bit, though, but when you actually look at what's happened, Mark McGowan in Western Australia is a Labor Premier. He's been going very much ahead, slightly different formula. He divvied up WA into 18 regions initially and said, well, you hang out in your own hood, that'll contain the virus and we'll come back to you when it gets better. That's been broken down, I think, to about 4 or 5 regions now where they're managing the movement between those regions, and he's been very keen on opening up the economy. Different a little bit in Victoria and a different approach in Queensland. I'm probably talking out of school here. Probably not the premiers, because those relationships with the Prime Minister are really good. It's more the company they keep. Where there's a sticking point, it's not hard to see influence of a heavy influence of a strong union in those states saying to their Labor premiers, you might think doing X, Y, and Z is a good idea. We don't think so. And I think those Labor premiers are probably looking to get these powerful unions that are on the company they keep to agree to the next steps. And I think you see a little bit of that in what's happening in the schools debate.
Well, it's exactly the question I was going to ask about schools. That seems to be one of the absolute hot topics, and there does seem to be quite a different view, and that's played out a couple of times in public between sort of federal and state, particularly with Daniel Andrews. Do you have a view on both how that's played out in a political sense, but also a view on what the right approach should be?
Well, I think my last answer gives you a sense of what the influences are at play, and I'm trying to stay classy about that. So, people can draw their own conclusions. But I suspect when some of the teaching unions are happier with opening, you'll see more movement on that front. That's very much what's playing out in Queensland and in Victoria, and that's reflective of where those governments are, and frankly, what they're support ecosystem looks like. So there's a heavy degree of influence from those powerful unions. Politically, it's interesting. I remember, and I should declare, I worked with Jeff Kennett when he was in Victoria. It was interesting when Jeff started struggling with popularity and people having views about him in the electorate after having saved Victoria, lifted it up off its knees. That decisiveness that he displayed, people see that when there's a crisis on. When the crisis isn't so vivid, they start wondering whether that's, a little bit over the top. And they start referring to it as, well, what's Jeff done to me today, sort of thing. I'm seeing a little bit of that in Victoria with the Andrews government. It's like, will Dan let me see my mum on Mother's Day? What will Dan do about this? So it's getting quite personalised, and given that I'm out of public life and out of politics, if I was advising him, I'd be saying I'd be very careful about that, because now people are really attributing those decisions on their personal liberties to one person when it might be a whole of government decision. The last thing I'd say, Frank, is it's interesting. You're seeing a little bit of unrest. A few people getting cranky about the restrictions. Still a minority, I would argue, but one that's growing would be my sense. But then you look at the UK, where they've had, incredible reactions to restrictions. And I'd have to say they barely started on the restrictions. There's still tens of thousands of people flying in to, UK airports from mainly Europe. So they're picking up the contagion out of Italy and Spain, and it's like, oh yeah, that's no big deal. Whereas we'd shut our airports to international travel weeks earlier, and I would argue the UK's barely got out of first gear on its restrictions. And now they're ramping them up, particularly with the focus on the elderly and the mortality rate. But even there, people are unhappy, and you're seeing a little bit of an international.
Well, you can trust. Yeah, well, you can trust that again, even with the United States. And I saw something about the people with firearms entering the Capitol building in Missouri to protest, which they're allowed to do apparently, bizarrely, to protest about the severity of restrictions over there. So it is something that you wonder how long this can go on for, just from a.
And it's curious too. You look at the mortality rates, and you compare, on a per capita basis, we're well under 1/10 what it is in most other major economies, and in some examples we're 1/100th of it. So that's a great success for our nation, and we've got capacity, and that was part of what flattening the curve was about, making sure our ICUs had all the resources, all the ventilators, all the capacity to cope. I think at last count there's maybe 60 people in intensive care in Australia, 60. That's a remarkable achievement that we should all be very proud of. But that gives us a solid base to look at what's ahead, but also a reminder that if we go too fast, we might be right back where we were. And the big worry at government level is not just a twin peak, it's actually a saw edge, where it might go down, up, down, up, down, up, and people are turning restrictions on and off. That's a big concern.
So, and we will get, because there are a couple of questions coming through now, which we'll get to in a second, but just to follow up to that, which I've sort of found it hard to get my own head around, which is what is the end game here? How is elimination of the virus a realistic option, or otherwise is it, the original flattening of the curve type hypothesis? We've almost been too successful before a reopen and a potential spike and a sawtooth in the way that you said. What would the discussions at government be looking like at the moment, and what does the plan look like over the next 6 months?
Well, it is all about containment, and that's one step short of elimination. I mean, elimination is a big call, mainly for two reasons. How durable is it? And to what extent does the elimination apply outside our own borders? If you go for an elimination play, what do you do when there's the subcontinent seeing the virus moving through? There's parts of Africa. We're seeing the challenges that Vladimir Putin's having in Russia. I mean, it's not something we alone can control. So the idea that there's a way of eliminating it, I think, is a little misguided. Or it might make sense at this point in time, but then what happens? and that's something that people. So that's why containment is the language that people are using. The flattening of the curve was not only a harm minimisation strategy within the population itself, and particularly for at-risk people, it was actually about buying time to build up treatment capacity and to make sure the health system could cope with it if it got out of hand. For us as a nation, it'll depend on how flat we can, how we can keep that at a very nominal, minimal level. And as you keep hearing, Frank, and for everybody, please log in and get your COVID app on. You need the COVID app, because one of the things that government policy will be looking at is the uptake of that app, because that then goes to our tracking capability. So if an infection appears, we can quickly shut it down, contain it, and and that's part of the strategy, maintaining that public distancing, the hygiene play, and also really heightened situational awareness across the whole population. So these are the sorts of things that are playing out. Obviously, longer term treatment is a lot of work's going into treatment, and Australia's doing some good work there. Some of it off the back of work that was done for SARS. But then SARS was well contained, so some of that research didn't go all the way through in clinical trials and commercialization. And then, people are aspiring for a vaccine, but as all of you will probably know, that's not a dead certainty, because, these kinds of infections don't always lead to an effective vaccine. You see this with common cold, you see this with other versions of coronavirus, and the virus itself may adapt over time. So they're all part of that picture, but it's a new normal, and we need to navigate that, and our businesses need to as well.
Yeah. Hey, first question that's come through on the blog, and thanks, Des, for sending it through, with regards to immigration, and there's lots of commentary about what the forward outlook is for immigration, not just obviously in the immediate sense when most borders are locked down, but what the prospects are for immigration to return to more normal levels, given that the economy has, and definitely certain sectors of the economy like housing and whatnot, have been underpinned by sort of our net migration inward. Do you think a return to some normal level of immigration is likely, and should we be looking at strategies in the midst of all this to admit more sort of inward migration to help get the economy back on its feet?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, Des, and thank you for throwing it in. You're very perceptive in that the impact on immigration is one of the key drivers on the economic modelling that Treasury and the Reserve Bank have been doing. I was just checking my notes, but with the reduction in immigration as a primary factor, and then I think we're net about 250,000 people that have left to return to where they might be their primary place of residence. For some that are here on extended stays, either as a business or a tourist visa, or others that have had other options to get back to family, that's washing through to what I'm seeing as a significant reduction in dwelling investment. That's expected to be down by 17% by June. So if you're in that building population growth driven area of the economy, they're predicting a 17% reduction in dwelling construction by the end of June. We're seeing some of that in early permits. So that's going to be an interesting indicator. And even by year end, they still think it'll be down by about 13%. So that's going to be with us for a while. Couple of things. The immigration story is very much driven by a skills influx into the economy. I'm hearing that still is very attractive. And in some cases, people have looked at the Australian response, thought about the situation of their families, thought about what we were just talking about in the longer term scenario, what would happen with the virus, and are thinking Australia's a pretty attractive place to be. And so that's sort of bumping us up the hit parade a bit. In the area of students, at last count, I think it's 140,000, give or take. I'd have to check my numbers, of student visa holders who would ordinarily be here that aren't. That's going to have an impact if there's a delay in bringing those students back in. And you've heard some of the universities basically saying to the government, pretty please, can we have our students back, even though the borders are closed conceptually to just about everybody else. So that's going to be an interesting policy one to navigate. So, over time, I think the net impact will probably see a strengthening of our migration position, but it's going to have a dip in the short term. The student play, it's quite hard to pick and what's going to happen out of China. A lot of students make their own choices, but if there's guidance from a central government that, studying in Australia would be frowned upon, that will have an impact. And it's a competitive market with Canada, with New Zealand, and so that might shake up the show a bit and give our universities a bit of a spook. And for many people that look at student visa holders who once graduate, look to have permanent residency, and you use that as a supply chain for talent into your businesses, that might need a bit of a recalibration as well.
Yeah. There's a bunch of questions now coming in, both sort of surrounding more specific industry type thoughts that you might have, and there's a couple that relate to some of the international outlook. And so I might get to those in a second and kind of group a couple of them together. But just sort of sticking with the sort of the overall policy response at the moment, and one of the things that gets, definitely around the water cooler in most offices is, the degree to which we've thrown stimulus at this, which has obviously been a necessary response. As we start to turn our minds to how do we pay this back, there are kind of two schools of thought that I've looked at, which is we need to, there's some level of increase in taxes and austerity type measures, and then I read an article by Paul Krugman in the New York Times that suggested, we never pay it back. We never paid back the debt from World War II. We just grow ourselves out of it, and the proportions kind of normalise over time. Do you have a view on what sort of we do with all this debt and how we repay it eventually?
Well, I mean, that'll be a topic that's going to be with us even when you, Frank, are middle-aged. So, that's going to be a discussion that's going to be hanging around for a while. Let me give you a bit of context. I mean, in terms of the stimulus that Australia has put in through a range of measures, we are around 9.9% of GDP. So that is an enormous chunk of change. Japan, 21%. The US is at around 11, although it's landed in different ways and people can't quite work out what's happening there. Across the EU, it's around 4%. 3% in the UK, and Germany and France are around 5%. So we're certainly up in the upper echelons of stimulus money going in. I reckon it'll depend a lot on what's next. There's already a discussion about how long JobKeeper should run and other measures and what's needed to get through, let's call it a harm reduction phase to get into a reboot, regrow phase. Now, if some of that harm reduction phase is shorter than it was anticipated, and that seems to be the case, we're at a place that we're probably, sometime earlier than we thought we'd be where we are with infection rates, maybe that might not need as long a tail. And some of that 120 billion can actually go into economic stimulus, kickstarting the economy, better investment, tax treatment, infrastructure projects. That might see us come out earlier. So that's part of it. If the tail's longer and then there's still an expectation to reboot the economy with some further stimulus, well, that's more money, Frank. And so, that's going to be where the discussions are heading. Look, I've 20 years in public life and I never lost an election. So that's got to be useful after 7 elections in a marginal seat. I got to tell you, the idea of higher taxes is not particularly popular. Now, you don't need someone who's been in the trenches as long as I have to explain that. But there is an economic argument too. You tax something more, you get less of it. So what are you going to tax more? You're going to tax more income at a time when people want to earn more? You're going to tax companies higher? What are you going to do? And there's this big discrepancy in Australia about the tax take, how much comes out of profits and out of earnings versus consumption. That's part of that conversation. So there's a big discussion around that going on. I don't know whether it'll be particularly cavalier moves in that area because people probably feel like enough's been done to them. And so where you're left with? Well, you're left with lifting all boats, grow the economy. What can you do to lift productivity? And that's why you've seen some of the discussions around, industrial relation reform and the like. Having said that, in the EU, no budget deficit has really been tackled by austerity or savings. EU finance ministers always say they'll grow the economy out of their budgetary challenges. They never do. So there's a credibility test there about how much you can do about growth as a driver to fund very substantial amounts of debt and deficit that's been generated. Not just now, Frank. This is likely to wash through for 3 budget years. So the out years are also something to consider as well. So I think government will be looking at how to turbocharge the economy. Another little thing, we did know there was 975,000 people lost their jobs in 6.5 weeks. The expectations are around 850,000 will return. What's been missed though is the number of hours worked has reduced by 20%. So some people have taken pay cuts and now work 4 days, not 5. Others have just not had that work. So when the economy comes back, there's a lot of this capacity in the economy that will be absorbed and deployed before you start seeing some of those other headline numbers move around. So,
yeah, really fascinating. The sort of shifting gears to the more international context, and one of the models that is definitely around our office, but also been talked about a lot in the media, is the Swedish model, which has been to develop some level of herd immunity, which is a concept we all now are familiar with, that probably no one had ever heard of before the pandemic. Do you have a view on the Swedish model, which is essentially that we end up in the same spot in 2 years' time if we can develop a herd immunity because of the prospects of a second dip and that sort of thing? Yeah,
look, I mean, one of the things that, well, even the Swedes have thought twice about this herd immunity model, and you might remember in the UK, that was some of the advice that the Johnson government was getting was, just go with the herd immunity. That's not a bad idea as long as it's not your great auntie that gets it and passes away. So, that's clinically and statistically an understandable point of view, but in a decision-making frame, that's a tough one to sell. It's going to happen anyway, but at a slower rate. And even in the UK, where they've reconsidered their game plan, the infections, got away from them essentially. And now, there's discussions of people over the age of 70 not leaving home and having their groceries thrown over the fence to them. It's not without its risks and it's not without its uncertainties. So you'll see some of that happening anyway. And I guess that's part of why you're seeing this comprehensive testing regime. And in some jurisdictions, they're now testing for antibodies, not just the infection. So they can get a handle on who's actually infected, but then get a handle on who may not have even known that they were infected, but now have antibodies. It's going to be a slow process here because of the effectiveness in containment. We'd need to really turn the show in a completely different direction if we were going to go to the herd immunity model. But that's happening in some jurisdictions. They're then getting little immunity passports. So they get tested, the antibodies are validated, and then they get, like an elephant stamp saying you're free to move about the place because you're in a position to fight the virus if it comes into your patch. So, a different strategy entirely. Ours will not pivot to that because that's an entirely different concept with entirely different public policy tools. But you'll see that emerging over time. It might become, part of the testing for migration and the movement of people. There's already discussion about tracking international shipping, and for ports that are concerned about the viral load in other ports, if your ships come from a, highly infected region and you're going to dock somewhere else, then a whole new regime would apply to the movement of goods and the people running those ships. So, I reckon there's still that'll still play out, but I'm not seeing a big pivot to herd immunity in Australia that would unwind an awful lot of the good work that's been done.
Yeah. Hey, staying internationally for a second, and then I do want to come back to just some more local industry type issues. But two of the big players in all of this, obviously the US and China. So I want to focus my next couple of questions on the two of them. So firstly, the US, and in particular the political response over there. You know, everything that sort of has happened since Donald Trump has taken over the presidency has been peculiar. And I noticed, you know, a tweet when he was boasting about that the ratings for his morning White House COVID-19 briefing had sort of outrated The Bachelor the night before, and, you know, crazy stuff like that. Just wondering if you had a take on how the US response, given they are sort of now the global hotspot in terms of infections, the overall response, and anything that you sort of wish to comment on in terms of the unique political situation they find themselves in at the moment.
Well, I've met a few presidents over my time, and suffice to say, President Trump is an interesting cat, and has his own way of doing things. How's that? That's as diplomatic as I can place it. But bear in mind, prior to COVID, he was going to get re-elected. You know, I mean, one of the things that a lot of people missed, and it's something I shared when I was working in the franchise community and interacting a lot with the US economy, the business entrepreneur enterprise culture in the United States and everyone involved in it thought the election of Donald Trump was the greatest thing since sliced bread. You know, he unilaterally ruled out every bit of regulation that Obama had introduced, I think, in the last 90 days, saying if it was such a good idea, why did you wait till near the end of your 8th year to introduce it? You're just pandering to special interests. The business community went, yay, you know. So yeah, business confidence has been sky high. Prior to the pandemic, they'd had the lowest rate of unemployment that anyone can remember, and optimism was running amok. And most of the people that voted for Donald Trump highly rated his performance, because as I think it was the New York Times wrote in a commentary, Donald Trump's popular because he's doing exactly what he said he was going to do. Now, this might sound odd, and we might find that hard to stomach in an Australian political context, but usually presidential candidates play to the bookends, often in their own parties, to win the primary. They then try and hang on to those bookends and move a little bit to the sensible centre to win the election. And once they've won the election, most of them then move to the centre of US politics, and people think that's okay. Well, Donald stayed out with the people that brought him to the dance. They love him for what he's doing, and the people that didn't like him now detest him. So, you know, it's an interesting environment. There's a phrase in the US called the flyover states. They're all the states that are in between the big population and economic centers around New York, Chicago, Boston, LA, San Francisco, you know, Houston, where the planes fly over. All those people, the flyover states, got Trump elected, and you know, they marched to his beat, if I could put it that way. This whole COVID thing has thrown that up in the air, where people are wondering around the sure-footedness of his administration and some of the work. The fatality rates are eye-watering. The health system is hemorrhaging. Yet the beaches of Florida were still packed on the weekend, and people still want to get out there and, you know, and get on with their lives. And you're right, there were armed people storming state legislatures saying, how dare you infringe on our freedoms? This is what the country is built on. So I can't pick what the election's going to do now, because it'll probably, everyone will forget about the economic record. And if you were in West Virginia or Pennsylvania and no one had had a job in 3 generations in your household, and Trump said, look, we just don't need more of the same, they'd go, you're right, sir, and you'd vote for it. You know, even if some of the prescriptions weren't going to be very helpful for their life, they might be thinking less about economic issues now, and so that's hard to play out. The US economy's, it's incredibly resilient, though. You know, never underestimate the entrepreneurial spirit in the United States. A lot of their businesses in a factory sense and in a professional services sense is still powering on. You know, obviously retail, hospitality, big part of the economy, that's struggling, and it's playing out differently in different states. I've just on the phone yesterday to a global management board telling me, what they're doing in the US, and half their challenge is trying to understand the different rules that apply in different jurisdictions. And so that'll settle. It's very untidy at the moment. The entrepreneurial class are still pushing on. They'll reinvent themselves, and I imagine they'll keep going. But the nationalism, and this is something we need to watch as a nation, economic nationalism is going to rise in its prominence. Even here, we're talking about nearshoring and onshoring vital supply chains, about having a heavy dependency on just one region or one supplier for inputs. I reckon you'll see a bit more of that. So I'm anticipating a more insular United States, a more combative United States in a foreign policy sense. And I worry a bit about what that does for, say, trading rules and norms that have enabled not just our economy, but, the greatest poverty alleviation in human history has been in Southeast Asia over the last 25 years. Why? Growth. Economic opportunities lifted people out of poverty. So even those countries that are aspiring to lift their living standards, I'd hate to see the appetite for trade diminish, but I fear it will.
Yeah. Well, and sort of staying internationally, one of the big issues that has emerged over the past few days really has been, a fracturing, definitely sort of optically of the Australian-Chinese situation, with the Australian government calling for the inquiry, and there's been a political response from the Chinese government. Do you have an opinion on what's happening there and how that will play out?
Yeah, look, I was very involved with the free trade agreement negotiations with China, and they're always character building. It's interesting when you're entering into a partnership on shared interest, even though the values aren't shared. That makes it difficult, and so you run into problems whenever the values dimension pops up and the shared interest maybe takes a secondary seat. And I'm sensing there'll be a little bit more of that. I mean, New Zealand's got a taste of it overnight for being cheeky enough to suggest that Taiwan should be part of the World Health Organization infrastructure, and China's said, no, this is offensive, how dare you. I reckon there'll be a bit more of that heavy strong arming through commerce and export and trade opportunities. I think that's a formula that's been deployed not infrequently, might be a diplomatic way of saying it, and I suspect it'll still be that way. For our economy and our relationships within the region, I'd say three things. The containment and the response of Southeast Asian countries overall, these big trading markets for us, has been much better than Europe and North Atlantic. They've done relatively well. Our Asian neighbours are familiar with SARS and a few other things, and I think their response has been doing quite well. I was just looking at the numbers that came out of the RBA report and even the IMF report. It seems to think there'll still be a lot of legs in the ASEAN economies, and that's going to really try and keep things moving forward, albeit after a bit of a setback. For our economy, look at mining, manufacturing, a lot of Chinese facing sort of exports have continued to function. The meat decision, the technical irregularity that surrounds that. What wasn't said was there's not exports of chilled beef going into China. That's continuing. In fact, I think I checked, the iron ore exports had their highest month ever. And in the Chinese economy, there's infrastructure investment holding up its GDP numbers, even though consumption is down. So that will still keep functioning. No, correct myself. Iron ore imports to China are up 22% last month. So the stuff's still going on. In large parts of China, the economy, maybe had a little bit of a stumble, but it's still powering on. The relationship, though, will continue to be fraught as people want to know more about the etymology of this virus, and that's not being at all well received from the Chinese central government.
And so what do you think happens from here to round that one out? So do you think there's a de-escalation in the rhetoric, acknowledging that not a lot of world leaders have lined up behind us to support the call for the inquiry, or do you think that we stick to our guns?
I'm not sure that's true. There's been a group. There's about a group of 8 that are advocating the need for this inquiry. Denmark. I mean, these aren't outlier jurisdictions. They're countries that are quite thoughtful in their international diplomacy, and interestingly, mostly what are called middle powers. So you don't get in the playground and in the road of the elephants fighting. You hang out with the monkeys and hang out with those that are in the jungle, but not necessarily the big behemoths. So we meerkats of the world can get along and have a conversation and let the big behemoths have a crack at each other. So that seems to be what's happening. Important not to have it look like an echo chamber of a US view. Important not to look like we're taking sides in the big arm wrestle, but just being sensible. I mean, who could argue that there's a need to understand how this happened and what we can learn from it? So I think sometimes you can get hung up on the reaction of people when really the best politics are thoughtful policy. Have a good reason to do something, be measured in your commentary, never overreact to an overreaction, don't sound shrill, and just go about your business. I wouldn't expect the rapport with any country, with China or any major power, is enhanced by appearing to abandon what you believe in and your own values just to keep the peace. You don't reinforce your standing by abandoning the things you believe in. But you can be thoughtful in the way you articulate them, and I think that's what's necessary, and that's what you'll see.
Yeah. Bringing it back locally, there are a number of questions I mentioned earlier, and maybe a sort of an interesting way to pose the question might be to sort of put yourself back in the shoes of the small business minister that you obviously once were, talking about a couple of specific industries. Hospitality and tourism have been right at the coalface of this since the very early days of the pandemic. What do you think the prospects are for re-emergence? How will that play out? And what would you do if you were the small business minister again? What sort of measures would you be championing inside the government?
Yeah, I suppose, can I be a bit cheeky? I mean, given you didn't send me any questions, Frank, and I've given you a touch up about that already, I imagine you'd probably ask me what would I be doing, and I can share with you what I am doing. I have my own small business and involved in a number of them. And if I could indulge for a minute, this is about how to put the in the small business engine. So I've got an 8-point plan starting with R's. So I'll be super quick. I mean, the first thing I do is be realistic in my assessment of the damage. I mean, really understanding what's the upshot of all of this. Where am I financially? Are my fundamentals still sound? Have my markets changed? Have my customers left? Have I been disrupted or disturbed by people's workarounds? What are there going to be ongoing restraints in the way I conduct myself? Are my systems up to it? I think you really need that sober assessment about, what realistically has happened. Number 2, I'd revisit and revise my business plan. If you think you can just push the button and keep going, that is a mistake. There'll be new work models around. How have those workarounds that you might have deployed been effective? Or you might be lucky enough to be in a segment where not much has happened to you, but what's happened around you in that ecosystem? Are people thinking differently about what you do? Have your customers changed? What are your competitors doing? Has that landscape shifted? Have you got a clear vision about the future? Because you can do a lot of things here and now and take you off track. Your reaction might not be that next sensible step in the game plan to your future. And sadly, it's a difficult one here for some businesses. You really need to get some good advice and be prepared if that advice includes, is it time to exit?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the adult conversation that really a lot of businesses, their owners and their teams need to have, that you won't hear talked about too much. Particularly if you're in an area where you'd already had, say, bushfire-related setbacks, and if you've been eating your capital just to keep a pulse in it, what are you going to do for my next R? What's your relaunch resourcing look like? I don't think there'll be an automatic rebound. I think there'll need to be work done to get in a position to be able to relaunch. What's it cost to restock? Your supply chain's still available. If you get the green light to open tomorrow, should you and could you? That restaurant hospitality play where a lot of people are saying 10 seats, 10 covers, just can't make it pay. That's a sensible conversation to have. Will there be a delay in getting your orders through? Is your tech and equipment up to date? Do you need finance to be in a position to grow again and to thrive? And above all, check out the Safe Work Australia website. It's not like once you can open your door again, it just goes back to the default it was when you shut them. There's a whole list of things you have to do, all the way down to how frequently you clean your loos. So, that's something that people should turn their minds to. Number 4, Frank, and I see you glazing over. I'll race through them, brother. What's the return runway look like? It's not going to just pick up where you left off. You need to mark and measure what that runway looks like. Timing your reopening. What's the timeline to be in a position to do so? When do you start bringing staff back? When do you turn up the dial and rescale maybe the business? Is there a 6 to 8 week period where once you're back in the game, there's not a lot of revenue coming in? Have the clear goals. I work with a software company that's actually, the Weight Watchers for small business, Frank. It actually says if you want something to change in your business, you need to change. And it sets out and works through an action plan and then looks to support you to make sure you do the things you actually think you need to do to get in that position. And if you don't get those things done, you're asked why. Is there a new obstacle that's come up? I mean, that kind of discipline is probably what's needed. Revise your budget. You take all of those top 4, that's a different outlook, and you need to reconsider your budget and the KPIs that sit there. Right now, a lot of people, and what I've been doing is relationship and renewal marketing, not out there trying to make the sell, but actually, supporting my customers and clients, staying engaged, seeing if I can add some people on the way through just at a relationship level and sustain those relationships so I can bounce back well. And when we're up and about, they're interested in what's happening in my business because I've been interested in what's happening in their world. And there's a little bit of localism that's popped up where, like a codependent economy, Frank, where local people have realized, if I want that in my local area and the livelihoods it provides and the services and goods it offers, I might need to be more involved myself. So it's a different dimension, that codependent economy. And people, frankly, are invested in business success. They really do want to know how you're going. It's like a reality TV show without the movie stars. They're just interested in how you're navigating all that. The other one was, a rerun. Prepare for a rerun. What happens next time? What if we do get another spike? What if that sore edge becomes something we have to contend with? Can we apply what we've learned? What would we do differently? What if the spikes come back? What if I've got, if I got risk identification and mitigation steps in place to support my resilience? And the last one is, am I ready? Am I refreshed? Am I good to go? This has been a tough phase. I'm back trying to teach my kids fractional arithmetic. We've got other things going. My wife's business has had its challenges in real estate. What a great time to be doing that. A lot of the people we know and in our world are having tough times. Am I emotionally spent? Am I fatigued by getting through this? Or am I ready? Am I ready? Am I prepared to present the best in my business? Can I inspire and lead my team so that we get the best out of them? Am I in the right place to make good decisions? And am I alert to what's going on around me? They're my 8 R's, Frank. That's what I've been doing, and that's what I've been encouraging people I work with to do. And I hope there's some value in that for our people on this webinar.
Fantastic. And I don't know if everyone, there was a couple of instances of sort of some technical difficulties at our end. So hopefully we'll be able to put those in writing at the end of this, Bruce, potentially, and shoot them out to everyone on the call and potentially to a broader audience. That was some really great advice. Final one from me, just keeping an eye on the time. We've spent most of the webinar talking about the here and now and sort of looking retrospectively, sort of looking forward now at some of the big picture impacts. A lot of talk about whether this is the end of globalization and whether this leads to borders becoming harder again, and And whether we need to, this will see the re-emergence of the Australian manufacturing industry as we look to sort of at least take control of the supply chains as they relate to, essential goods and services and that sort of thing. Do you have an opinion on the forward outlook in that regard?
Yeah, I do, and I think you've characterised some of the key influences, Frank. I mentioned earlier this economic nationalism. Now that doesn't have to be fundamental. I used to say in most things in life, they're rarely black or white, and I'd say they'd be shades of grey, and then the movies came out and you couldn't use that phrase, but it's going to be somewhere in between. I think it's going to edge more towards a more nationalistic outlook on the economy. That goes to things like, well, what is our sovereign capability in our own country to sustain us, not just our economy, but you saw PPE issues, you saw a high dependency on supply chains. My favourite friend, Justin, for Just in Time, a lot of people going, I wish I'd never known Justin, or at least had his cousin in there. That was a gag, Frank. Thanks for the positive feedback. So a bit of a rethink around those supply chains. Also, when I was a minister in the defence portfolio, I did some work on sovereign jewels. What do we need strategically to support our own capability? I won't go into all the gory details, but there was a military conflict where our jet fighters were involved, and our wing-mounted missiles were needed, and we found our one supplier was sending them all to the Americans, and we had aircraft without the proper munitions in theatre, not able to do their work because we couldn't buy any missiles. Now, that's let's say suboptimal is the nicest way of putting it. That sort of rethink is happening in a lot of businesses. If I've got a heavy dependency on just one supply channel, what happens if that's inhibited? What do I do? Is there a nearshore or onshoring option? Is there some way I can build a robustness in my supply chain and in my business to keep me going? The flip side of that, though, is if our people are thinking that way, what are other jurisdictions, what are other countries thinking? And that's where, we need to think long and hard about that. Those racks of meat going into China, why do we do that? Well, we grow and make enough food to feed 3 times our population. If we weren't able to export, we wouldn't have the opportunities to actually make profit and livelihoods out of things that we excel at. Yet at the same time, a fortnight ago, we became the largest exporter of gas. We beat Qatar. Yet if you're in the manufacturing sector and you have gas as a feedstock or a key input to your business, A, it's hard to get, and B, it's eye-wateringly expensive. Yet we're the largest exporter in the world. So I think that sort of stuff is what's going on, and Nev Power and the team that are advising the Prime Minister and the government around these economic considerations have that as one of their frames. So I think there'll be more of that, Frank. That'll present opportunities for SMEs in Australia. It might present some challenges where other countries are doing likewise, and our expertise, particularly in professional services and the like, going out into the world, people thinking, we might tighten that up a little bit. Behind the border restrictions around licensing, there's a whole range of things that could wash out, but stay alert to that. That's that situational awareness I was talking about. So I think there will be a recalibration on some of that, and people looking nearer to home, not just in our country, but elsewhere. Really
interesting. I think naively you always think about it from your own perspective, but sort of thinking about that there's 2 sides to the trade coin. It's a really interesting thing to sort of keep in perspective.
The trade numbers are a little bit untidy. Even in the Reserve Bank's forecast and in the IMF's report, they're basically saying it's pretty grim for the rest of the calendar year, and we'll be well into 2021 before it starts looking a little bit more normal. That's off the back of this V-shaped recovery that everyone's talking about. That'll be a sharp turnaround, and I'm an optimistic guy. I'm so positive, even my blood group is positive. But gee, I hope that does happen, because that's not home and hosed either.
Yeah. Hey, Bruce, that hour has whizzed by. I did just want to take the opportunity to thank you, not just for you've been a supporter in the recent history of Judo Bank, in Judo Bank's entire existence, but in the recent history in the context of your involvement in the SME community, but more broadly a passionate supporter of this sector of the economy for decades. And so I wanted to thank you for your time on behalf of us and our customers. I think that was hugely insightful and really interesting. Don't know if you had sort of any final thoughts for the guys on the line.
Well, I just respect. I mean, I think what's happened is a bit of an awakening that without businessmen and women, entrepreneurs, where are the livelihoods? So, it's a big thank you from me. I'm evangelistic about SMEs and the people that lead them and conceive them and drive them and enable them to deliver great value right across our economy, but in our community. And I think there's been a real revelation that the small business and the SME challenge has had an impact on communities and on households. So maybe when we talk about lifestyle, livelihoods is there very much front and center. And that'll be a great tribute to all of you on this call that are out there creating wealth and opportunity for yourselves and others. Maximum respect from me, and thank you, and well done, Judo.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bruce. The only other question that we didn't answer that came through the chat line was from Des again, who commented on your Judo puffer vest and how he can get his hands on one. I'm sure we can flick one out to Des once the call is done. So we'll take care of you on that, Des.
Why don't you and the team look at who's asked the 3 best questions, and each of them gets a puffer jacket.
Love it. Love it. We've done that.
Encourage participation.
That's written in stone. Fantastic. Really appreciate it, Bruce. To everyone on the line, thank you again for tuning in. We're here with you through this, and don't be shy to reach out if you need anything. Otherwise, I'm sure one of the team will be in contact very soon. Thanks, everyone, again.
Thanks, everybody.